I think we can just cut it short. I can't remember how to speed it up, so... Oh, I can see it now. Anyway, we'll just cut it short. So, hello everybody, and welcome back to another stream of Skievers Idle Book Club. So, it's been a couple of weeks, and I apologise for that. I have been very sick with the cold, so I haven't been up to streaming and therefore reading out loud. I've had a sore throat, but I am feeling better now and ready to get back into it. So for those of you that have been here the last time, we last left off with our heroine going around collecting samples to find out what this mysterious virus is about, and upcoming to the second trial by ordeal, which is the fire one. So let's get into it. I'll buy some stuff first, deal with some stuff. Sharky has added some very nice progress bars and stuff for us now, and the mature content disclaimer is also there now for the book. Absolutely disgusting, Grandma. Wow, thanks, Grandma. Alright, well, we've got lots of cookies. So I say we buy... Do we have a time machine? I can't remember. That's the Alchemy Lab. That's the portal. That's the time machine. So we have 7. We have 1 antimatter condenser. I should have known that, actually. So let's buy 2. Still got 1 billion. So let's buy 10 Alchemy Labs. What do we have up here? 9 billion. There, 9 billion. 9 plus billion, so that's fine. So we'll just ignore those. We've got 2 of those portals, so I think we're right just to get back into it. So you'll notice down the bottom of the stream that there's now a progress bar for how many chapters and how many pages we're up to. So we are up to chapter 17 in our book, if you are reading along on your own, or if you're just interested where we're up to. We're up to chapter 17. So I say, let's get into it, and we will go from there. Chapter 17. How did you go? Kiva and Nari had barely set foot inside the infirmary before Tip was upon them, bouncing up and down as he waited for an answer. I should have enough to get started, Kiva told him, patting her bag. How did you go? I got a few, the young boy answered, gesturing to the floor near the workbench where he'd used a mash-up of items to construct a small circular pen. How many is a few? Kiva asked, following him over to it. 5, Tip said, but Grendel told me that she's seen a heap nesting near the crematorium, so I should be able to get as many as you need. Nodding with approval, Kiva looked down at the 5 rats running around the pen. Deciding not to comment on the makeshift obstacles Tip had fashioned from scraps for them to use as playthings. Instead, she said, once I have samples from other places, we'll need a way to separate them. I can't have quarry-tested rats mixing with farm-tested rats, or any of the others. If they get sick, I have to know what the origin was. Already on it, Tip replied. Mott's coming by later to help me divide the pen into sections. Kiva placed her bag carefully on the workbench. Actually, I could use Mott helping me. Jaren can help you, Nari told Tip. He's good with his hands. Kiva's brow shot upwards. Nari rolled her eyes. I heard him telling some of the tunnelers. Sorry about that. I heard him telling some of the tunnelers that he helped his brother build a fort to play in. He's good with his hands at building things. The stern way she looked at Kiva might as well have been a screaming reiteration of what she had said the other night, that she only ever behaved professionally toward the prisoners, including Jaren. Coughing quietly, Kiva said, "Sounds like a plan." She then arranged her quarry samples on the bench, deciding her next steps as a flash of panic. The trial by fire was in 2 days. 2 days. If her family didn't come soon... Kiva shoved the thought from her mind. There was nothing she could do but hope that they would. And if they didn't, she had to have faith in the princess's words, in her magic. She had to have faith in the Valentis, one of the last people Kiva would ever choose to trust, and yet perhaps her only option if she wanted to remain alive. Gritting her teeth, Kiva sought distraction in her work. If she didn't find a way to treat the stomach illness, there was a high possibility that she herself would get sick. If that happened, well, at least she wouldn't have to worry about the trials anymore. Nor would she need a rescue. With that grim thought, she pushed all her concerns aside and focused on her task. Hours went by as she prepared for and began dosing the rats, mixing in small amounts of what she'd collected in her own food rations and dropping the offerings into the pen. While Kiva didn't like testing live animals, she knew that these rats were living on borrowed time. If Boots didn't catch them, then starved prisoners would. Either way, their fate was sealed. "What now?" Nari asked when Kiva had made sure all of the rats had eaten a traceable amount. "Now we wait." The guard looked as if she wanted to ask more, but at that moment Jaren walked into the infirmary, stealing their attention. Doing a double take, Kiva demanded, "What happened to you?" Jaren raised his hand to his face, as if doing so would hide the impressive bruise darkening his eye. Or the graze on his forehead, or his split lip. "Nothing," Jaren answered. "How did you go today?" Nari stepped closer and jabbed a finger toward Jaren's wounds. "The healer asked you a question." "And I said it's nothing." Jaren strode by Tip, playfully messing up the young boy's hair as he passed, and then stopped when he was before Kiva. He looked down at the rats briefly before asking, "No problem getting your quarry samples?" Kiva studied his injuries, deciding that if he was capable of risking his life by brushing off the guard, he must not be too badly hurt. But given their environment, he would still need treating. "I'll make you a deal," she said. "You let me clean you up, and I'll answer your questions." Jaren cocked his head to the side. "Any questions?" "Just those two." His teeth flashed in a quick smile. "That's hardly an incentive. I have lots of questions, and you're rarely in an answering mood." "I'm not in an answering mood now." When Jaren just continued looking steadily at her, Kiva weighed up how hard it would be to wrestle him into submission, and finally said, "Fine, but only if I get to ask questions too." His smile was wider this time. "I've never withheld answers from you before. You're terrible at negotiating." In response, Kiva simply pointed to the nearest metal bench. "Sit." Jaren chuckled but did as ordered. Nari, however, looked about a second away from shaking an explanation out of him. The dark look on her face. Kiva couldn't help wondering if maybe Nari did have feelings for Jaren, but her own code of ethics wouldn't allow her to act on them. Or perhaps the same code of ethics meant she was still new enough at Zalandov to struggle with the brutality heaped on the prisoners, and seeing the evidence on Jaren's face was enough to distress her. If so, she would need to grow a tougher skin fast, or she wouldn't survive much longer at the prison. Whatever the reason, Kiva knew an intervention was needed, so she quickly asked Tip, "Can you go and tell Mott we won't need him tonight, but I could still use his help tomorrow?" When the young boy nodded eagerly, Kiva turned to Nari and added, "Would you mind going with him? It's getting late, and I don't want him wandering on his own." It was a poor excuse, as Tip often walked around the prison alone, regardless of the hour. But given the attitudes of the guards lately and the growing dissent among the inmates in the wake of Tilda's arrival, especially the rebels, who already had Tip in their scopes, what Kiva had said was true. and Nari of all people knew that. The guard nodded her agreement, if stiffly, but that was likely also because she caught Kiva's subtle wink, a signal that she would try to get Jaren to talk. Even so, Nari's features remained tight as she left the infirmary with Tip in tow. And here I was thinking you were avoiding me. Kiva turned to meet Jaren's mirthful eyes. Pardon? You? Me? He said, waving a hand between them, lest there be any confusion. We're rarely alone. I figured that was your doing. Inwardly kicking herself for sending away her two buffers, Kiva said, We're not alone now, and looked to where Tilda slept on the far side of the room. Jaren followed her gaze. Any improvement with her? Kiva knew he wasn't asking because he cared about Tilda. He had made his feelings toward the rebel queen and her cause abundantly clear. But he did care about Kiva, and he knew that for whatever illogical to him reason she cared about Tilda, that it even meant anything to him, that she even meant anything to him, had her fighting to ignore the warmth spreading throughout her veins. Is that your first question? Kiva asked, knowing it wasn't, but also wanting to avoid admitting how concerned she was about Tilda's lack of improvement. She had hoped time would help, but the ill woman had been under Kiva's care for 3.5 weeks now, and with little to show for it. Jaren studied her for a long moment, seeing everything she wished he couldn't. As if knowing exactly what she needed him to say, he sent her a grin and replied, Only if that's yours. Kiva turned away so that he wouldn't see her lips curling up at the edges, and busied herself by collecting her medical supplies. When she returned to stand in front of where he sat, perched on the bench, she reached for his chin and said, Want to tell me how this happened? He tutted. I get to start. It's usually ladies first, Kiva said, turning his face to the side. I took you as more of a liberal woman, the kind who'd scoff if I went all gentlemanly on you. Kiva snorted. Nice try. And besides, Jaren said jovially, I've already asked my first questions. Since Kiva had agreed to those, she dunked her cloth in the salted water and then said, This'll sting, before pressing it to Jaren's cut lip. While he was wincing away the pain, she told him about her day at the quarry, and how she'd actually enjoyed being in Nari's company. He didn't show any reaction to that, nothing to indicate his own feelings towards the guard. So Kiva went on to share how they'd come back, and she'd begun testing Tip's rats. How long will it take before they start to show symptoms? Jaren asked, looking at the makeshift pen. If they do, Kiva corrected, since there was no guarantee the sickness originated in the quarry. I'm not sure, but I'm hoping Mott can help me speed up the process tomorrow. He knows a lot more than me when it comes to experimental testing. Because he's older? Kiva shook her head, dunking her cloth again. It's always the case with apothecaries and healers. Apothecaries know so many different remedies, while healers know the body those remedies go into. Seeing the furrow in Jaren's brow, she tried to explain better. If someone sick comes to a healer, we diagnose and then treat them with medicine, but rarely do we make it ourselves. A lot of what we use comes from an apothecary, or it's an assortment of ingredients that we mix together based off an apothecary's recipe. Their role is to make medicine. Ours is to decide which treatment is needed and administer it. That would be true in the outside world. Things were different in Zalandog, and Kiva often had to make do with what she had, creating her own remedies using a small medicinal garden behind the infirmary and whatever other supplies she could scrounge up. So you're saying that healers are the hands and apothecaries are the brains. Kiva scrunched her nose at his analogy, but said, Close enough. She began cleaning the greys on his forehead and added, somewhat musingly, This is all common knowledge. I'm surprised you don't know it already. I didn't have much of a chance to learn about this kind of thing in my childhood, Jaren shrugged. My medicine always came directly from a healer, so I just assumed they made it themselves. He gestured toward the workbench, like you do here. His answer wasn't surprising, since any good healer maintained a healthy stockpile of supplies. Kiva's father had always kept more than he'd ever needed on hand, and was careful to do a regular inventory to avoid the risk of running out. That was something he'd repeatedly emphasized when she'd started under his tutelage. Better to be over-prepared than under-prepared, little mouse. If you get an influx of patients, it can mean the difference between life or death, so best to stock up whenever you can. What was surprising was Jaren's lack of what Kiva considered general life knowledge, and she debated pressing for more details, but was unsure what to ask. She'd assumed for some time that he'd come from a wealthy upper-class family, but now she'd wondered if she'd been wrong. Perhaps the opposite was true, especially if his parents hadn't hired a tutor to teach him such things. Maybe they hadn't been able to afford one. Well, now you know, Kiva said in an upbeat voice, not wanting to make him uncomfortable. People, especially men, could react poorly if they thought their intelligence was being criticized. Setting down her cloth, she reached for her small pot of balaco sap, and without thinking scraped some onto her finger and leaned forward to dab it onto his cut lip. Jaren sucked in a startled breath, and Kiva's eyes jumped up to meet his. They were so close, her fingertip frozen on his lip. She had a split second to decide what to do. Part of her wanted to leap backwards and put as much distance between them as possible, but she knew how that would look, how he might perceive such an action, how telling it would be that she was so affected by him. So despite her entire nervous system being hyper-aware of how and where she was touching him, she continued applying the healing sap to his wound with unhurried ease, willing the heat from her cheeks, and praying to anyone who would listen that she looked more relaxed than she felt. This isn't too bad, so it should be better within a couple of days, Kiva said, her voice half a note higher than usual. She cleared her throat quietly and was finally able to move her hand from his mouth, reaching toward his forehead. This graze nearly touches the scar you got the day you arrived, but you're luckier this time. It's shallow and should heal without leaving a mark. She gently smeared sap over the wound, and remembering the 2 dead men who had been delivered to Zalandov with him, added, "You never did tell me what happened, or how you came to be here." There was a small pause before Jaren answered, "I thought you said it was rude to ask people what led to their imprisonment." His tone was joking, but there was a seriousness to his eyes, a warning that Kiva, despite her curiosity, decided to heed. "Fair enough. But what about today? Ready to tell me what happened?" She rinsed her sticky hand in the salted water and then walked over to the workbench under the guise of collecting some aloe gel. In truth, she needed a moment away from him, but she turned back again when he started talking. I had a run-in with another prisoner at dinner, someone who claimed to be an old acquaintance of yours," Jaren said, almost too casually. "I didn't like the way she was talking about you, and her friends didn't like when I asked her to stop. Things escalated until we were no longer speaking with words." Kiva had been walking back toward Jaren when he'd begun speaking, but she'd frozen mid-step halfway through his answer. "Please tell me you're kidding," she croaked out. Jaren pointed to his face. "Does it look like I'm kidding?" In a flat voice, Kiva said, "It was Cresta, wasn't it?" "Red hair, snake tattoo?" Jaren asked. When Kiva nodded, he said, "That's her. She likes to talk big, but she isn't a fan of sticking around once the action starts." Kiva already knew that much. Cresta was notorious for stirring up trouble and then letting others finish her dirty work, scrambling away before seeing any consequences herself. It was a miracle that Jaren and whomever he'd ended up in a fistfight with hadn't been dragged away by the guards and sent to the abyss for punishment, or the gallows. "You're such a fool," Kiva hissed, stomping the rest of the way over to him. It took all of her healer training to keep her fingers gentle as she applied aloe gel to his bruised eye, being extra careful around the parts that were already beginning to swell. "Is that the thanks I get for defending your honor?" Jaren shot back, sounding Indignant? You should have heard what she was calling you. Zalandov's expletive, the heartless carver, the princess of death, the healer expletive, the prison pus. Yes, Jaren interrupted tightly, a muscle ticking in his cheek, among others. Trust me, I've heard them all, Kiva said, applying more gel. But you don't see me getting into fights over them, especially with the prison rebels. Goodness, what were you thinking? The prison... Jaren broke off with a curse. Are you serious? As serious as death, Kiva said flatly, which you need to prepare for if they decide to put a target on your back. In a low tone, Jaren said, I didn't realize who they were. Cresta is their leader in here, Kiva said, prompting Jaren to swear again. Her gaze travelled over to Tilda, and she added, You're lucky they have bigger concerns than you right now, or your next step would be the morgue. A strained moment passed before Jaren quietly asked, Doesn't it bother you, what they say? Not just Cresta, but everyone? Doesn't it hurt? They're just words, Kiva said, ignoring the pang in her heart. Of course it hurt. No one wanted to be known as an expletive or any of the other names that had been slung at her over the last decade. They're not just words, Jaren argued. They're mean, untrue, slandering, said by disrespectful bullies, and you don't deserve to be treated like that. You're losing sleep trying to help all these people, including Cresta, and the least they can do is not to publicly insult you. Finishing with the gel, Kiva stepped back and said, Shouldn't that be for me to decide? Jaren frowned. What? Kiva pointed a finger to her chest. They're saying those things about me. Shouldn't I get to decide whether or not to punish them? Or do you think I'd have chosen to have you slam your fist into their faces just to prove an object lesson? The gold in Jaren's eyes blazed angrily against the blue. You weren't there. And you weren't there for the last 10 years of this happening, Kiva snapped back at him. You think I don't know how to handle this by now? You think I haven't tried retaliating and learnt firsthand just how much worse that makes it? Jaren had the decency to look ashamed, so Kiva made an effort to gentle her tone as she went on. I'm touched that you were upset by what you heard, but I don't need you fighting my battles for me. I've been here long enough to know the best thing I can do is ignore it and act like it doesn't affect me. They can say whatever they want, and 9 times out of 10 they end up apologizing anyway, usually when they're sick or hurt and realize I'm the only one who can help them. Not, she added with emphasis, that I would withhold treatment if they didn't show remorse, just that when they experience for themselves that I actually do care about them, they no longer take their anger out on me, because that's all it is, Jaren. They're angry and upset and frustrated and helpless, like all of us in here. They just vent their emotions in the wrong ways. Jaren said nothing for a long moment, but then jumped down from the bench as he asked, I'm guessing Cresta isn't one of the 9 and 10. Kiva didn't need to confirm, though she did warn, she's dangerous. If you value anything I say, stay away from her. I value everything you say, Kiva. The words were quiet, serious, and they caused Kiva's eyes to lock on his, finding him looking back at her steadily, solemnly. Silence descended upon them as they stared at each other, both processing what the other had said. It was Jaren who broke it first, his voice filled with an apology. I'm sorry I acted like such a brute. It won't happen again. He didn't break their locked gazes as he went on. And just so you know, I don't see you as some kind of damsel who needs rescuing. I've never met anyone stronger than you, not just because you've survived a decade in this awful place, but because you've sacrificed your own needs over and over again to serve those around you, even, and especially, those who don't want your help. So you're right, you don't need me fighting your battles. He moved a step closer, his tone husky as he finished. But, if you let me, I'd like to be standing beside you as you fight them. Kiva's pulse was thrumming loudly in her ears, butterflies swarmed in her stomach, bolts of electricity tingled her flesh. She didn't know how to respond, could barely think over her physical reaction to his declaration. Careful, careful, careful. The words weren't her father's, or her mother's, or anyone else's. They weren't from a memory, they were from Kiva to herself. Her one and only rule at Zalendorf was not to make any friends, because she would always, always lose them. With Jaren, she wasn't sure if it was friendship he was asking for, or more than that, but either way, it was a line she could not and would not cross. No matter how her heart was beating, no matter how he was looking at her right now, waiting for her response, she couldn't make any exceptions. I'm sorry, I can't, was what she'd been about to say, the words already forming on her lips. Before she could utter them, Tip bounced back into the infirmary, followed closely by Nari, and Kiva lurched away from Jaren, dragging trembling fingers through her hair as she walked on wobbly legs towards the workbench. She didn't dare look back at Jaren, not as Tip asked for his help reconstructing the rat pen, not as Jaren quietly agreed and asked what supplies they had to work with. Kiva's mind was racing, until she felt a feather-light touch on her hand and jumped, spinning to find that Nari had stepped up silently beside her. You all right? The guard mouthed, as if aware that Kiva didn't want any attention drawn to her right now. Kiva was about to nod, but she couldn't bring herself to lie to Nari after having spent all day with her. She instead gave an honest, quick shake of her head and held her breath, waiting to see what the guard would do, but Nari only looked between her and Jaren, then turned back with a small, compassionate smile before mouthing, You will be. And Kiva believed her, mostly because she decided that for her own peace of mind, she would act like her conversation with Jaren had never happened. Chapter 18. Kiva had intended to head back outside the prison with Nari the next morning to collect samples from the farms. But not only was the guard absent from the infirmary, something else more urgent took Kiva's attention. Tilda stopped breathing. It was pure luck that Tip happened to be walking past her bed when she started convulsing. Pure luck that Kiva was checking on the quarantined patients and close enough to come running when the boy screamed for her. Pure luck that she was able to resuscitate Tilda using chest compressions. Kiva was covered head to toe in sweat by the time the woman was stable again, part from fear, part from how hard she'd fought to keep Tilda hanging on to life. Tip was shaking like a leaf and looked as pale as poppy milk. Kiva administered to the sick woman, hoping the drug would relax her system and keep her from slipping into another convulsion. What was that? Tip asked when it was finally over, his voice shrill with residual panic. Don't worry, it's normal for someone who's been this sick for so long, Kiva assured him, gently pushing him onto a stool before he could fall over. I should have been watching her more carefully. In truth, Kiva had no idea why Tilda had just gone into cardiac arrest, because she still had no idea what the rebel queen was suffering from. It could have happened for the reason she'd just told Tip, or it could be that Tilda was slowly slipping away from them day by day. Don't let her die. There was nothing Kiva could do about Tilda's health other than keep her comfortable and protect her from the imminent death of the ordeals, the next one of which was only a day away. But Kiva couldn't think about that right now, unable to handle the way her chest tightened and her breath shortened at the very thought of what she was soon to face. As the hours ticked by, she was sure of only one thing. There was no sign yet of her family and the rebels, no evidence that they'd received her note and were conscious that time was of the essence. More and more, it was looking like she would have to put trust in the princess's amulet to keep herself alive. For the rest of the day, Kiva was afraid to step out of sight of Tilda, remaining close in case she had another episode. When the quarantined patients needed checking, she sent Tip in to see them, and when Nari finally showed up, Kiva claimed claimed that her day was better spent testing the quarry rats with Mott rather than gallivanting around the prison for more samples. The last was true, since she did need to test the rats, but it was also an excuse to remain in the infirmary, watching over the ill woman. When Mott arrived mid-morning, Kiva explained the situation, and the ex-apothecary sat in silence for a good 5 minutes, chewing on his dirty thumbnail, and wearing a crinkled brow. Finally, he rattled off a list, pointed him in the direction of the medicinal garden. When he returned with laden arms, he proceeded to take over her workbench, waving her over so he could explain how to create and administer what he referred to as his augury elixir. "This'll tell you what you need to know in a few hours," Mott said, once he was finished, offering a smug, brown-toothed grin as they peered down at the greenish concoction. "That's amazing," Kiva said to the elderly man, inhaling the sweet floral aroma. "Thanks, Mott." "You just let me know if you need anything else, love," he replied, handing over the ladle and stretching his hunched back, the resulting cracking sounds making Kiva cringe. "These old bones can't keep up with the dead you keep sending my way. Best you figure out what this illness is before it takes all of us, eh?" "That's the plan," Kiva told him, just as Tip stepped back through the quarantine door and sealing it behind him. The look on his face meant Kiva knew what he was about to say before he spoke. "We lost another one," Kiva sighed. "Who?" "A woman from the workrooms. I think she repairs the guards' uniforms." Tip's throat bobbled and he amended, "Repaired." Mott ran a hand over his balding head. "I'll send someone round to get her," he exhaled loudly. "Almost feel like I should leave someone here to keep dragging 'em over when they drop, since it's happening so often now. Did you know Grundle's been asked to stoke the second furnace? Rook made the request himself, so he must think this is enough of an epidemic to plan for extra burning." The warden had made the right move, Kiva thought, since the last thing they needed was for the bodies to pile up in the morgue, especially if the illness was infectious. Even if it wasn't, the dead couldn't lie around rotting as they waited for their turn to be cremated. Best to get them out of the way and lessen the risk of other diseases beginning to spread because of the mass decaying of flesh. "Tip, can you walk Mott back to the morgue and then head to the rat's nest Grendel mentioned? We'll need some more for my next samples, so catch as many as you can carry," Kiva said, thinking the young boy could use some fresh air and time away from the near-constant cloud of death over the infirmary. His blue eyes brightened at the idea of hunting for more vermin, something that Kiva couldn't begin to understand the thrill of, but perhaps that was because she wasn't an 11-year-old boy. To Mott, Kiva gestured to the elixir and said, "Do I just mix this into their food?" "Yeah, you can do that, sure, or in their water," he said, "or you can just shove it down their throats with a dropper." Kiva pulled a face at the contact that would require. "I think I'll keep my distance, thanks." Mott laughed, a deep wheezing sound that should have been repulsive, but was instead almost comforting. "You take care of yourself, Kiva, love," Mott said, hobbling toward the door with Tip trailing behind him. "And best of luck tomorrow. If I were a betting man, you'd have my gold." He paused, then added, "You've got yourself a plan to survive?" Kiva's insides tightened, a ball of tension settling like a rock in her stomach. She reached automatically for the amulet tucked beneath her tunic, its now familiar weight offering a hint of reassurance. She still believed, still hoped that it wouldn't be needed. There was still time for the family to come, but if they didn't, she wished she knew what was in store for her the next day. Wished she'd thought to ask the princess if she had to do anything to make the elemental magic in the amulet work. Wished she didn't have to face the trial at all, but wishing had never done her any good before, just as she knew it wouldn't now. The look on Tip's face kept Kiva from sharing her uncertainty with Mott, and instead she croaked out, "Of course, I'm not at all worried." Mott squinted at her, then looked at Tip, who was beaming with relief at Kiva's apparent confidence. I see, the old man said. Without another word, he turned and hobbled back toward the medicinal garden, returning with yet another load and dumping it all on Kiva's workbench. She watched in baffled silence as he measured, sliced, and ground his concoction before rifling through her supplies until he found a jar of carrot oil that Tip had spent hours painstakingly collecting. Mott poured the entire jar into his mixture and gave it a stir, and then thrust it toward Kiva. Let it sit overnight, he instructed her. Inhaling the delicious fresh scent, Kiva asked, "What is it?" Mott placed his wrinkled hand on her shoulder. "It's for your trial, Kiva love, to help protect you." When she stiffened with shock, he gave her a gentle squeeze and nodded to the pot. "It'll turn waxy by morning. Make sure you smear that good and proper all over your skin. Do you hear me? It won't save you if they plan to set you up on a pyre, but it'll do more than any other salve you can think of. Might give you a fighting chance, extra time to get free or something." He paused. "Just don't get into your eyes, though. It'll sting." Kiva didn't know whether to laugh or cry or vomit at the thought of a pyre. It seemed as if Mott, like her, assumed it was an option she might have to face. Surprising them both, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him, an unprecedented display of affection from her, and enough to startle him so much that he failed to return the embrace before she stepped away again. "Thank you, Mott," she said, with feeling. "Truly. You can thank me after the trial is over and you're still alive," he said, his ruddy cheeks slightly pink. He turned to Tip, who was smiling even wider than before, as if certain Mott had given Kiva a foolproof way to survive. "Come on, boy, time's a-wastin'." The two of them exited the infirmary, leaving Kiva with only her thoughts for company. Soon enough, her fears about the next day began to scream for attention. She needed a distraction, something to keep her from spiraling into panic. She had the amulet, and if the magic in it failed, she now had Mott's protection, even if he'd warned of the mixture's limitations. There was nothing more she could do. She needed to stop thinking about it, since that was only making it worse. Glancing over at Tilda, Kiva made a snap decision. Aside from the guard at the door, the two of them were alone, so she walked over to the rebel queen's bedside and peered down at her. She was deathly pale, even more so than when she'd first arrived, her tan having slowly faded as if all the life had leached out of her during her weeks spent in bed. Kiva again wondered how long she'd been sick before arriving, if it was a new ailment or something she'd been fighting for some time. She had so many questions, more than she'd ever be able to even ask. Even if Tilda were to miraculously recover. "What are you doing here?" Kiva whispered to her. "How can I make you better?" Tilda, of course, didn't answer. Kiva wondered if it was a fluke that they'd managed a semi-lucid conversation before the first ordeal. Perhaps it had been nothing but luck and timing that she'd heard her awaken that night. She wished Tilda's cloudy eyes would open again and that she'd say something, anything, to help Kiva remember why she was fighting so hard to keep her alive. Not that she needed a reminder, but she longed for some small comfort from a dying woman, a woman that Kiva was risking everything to save, and yet still failing. "Stay alive, don't let her die. We are coming." Sighing loudly, Kiva sat beside Tilda's bed, and, being careful to remember that the guard was within hearing distance, picked up her hand, holding it gently in her own. "If my father were here, he'd say it's possible that you can hear everything that's happening," Kiva said quietly. "He'd say it's important that you know someone is watching over you, wanting you to live." Kiva squeezed her hand. "He'd probably tell you a story. He used to do that for me whenever I was sick. Him and my mother," Kiva choked on the word. Just as memories of her father pained her, so too did those of her mother, but for different reasons. Kiva knew there was nothing her mother loved more than their family. She would have done anything to protect them. 10 years ago, her youngest son had died, and her youngest daughter and husband had been carted away to Zalandov. Kiva couldn't imagine what her mother must have gone through after that, or how she must have felt upon receiving Kiva's note, bearing news of Farron's death. A husband and son, both gone forever, a daughter imprisoned, half their family ripped apart. Blinking back tears, Kiva focused on Tilda, not allowing her mind to wander any further. I don't know many stories, but... She paused, bit her lip, then went on. My father used to tell me one when we first arrived here, repeating it over and over again. The story of how he met my mother. Kiva wasn't sure if she could do this, not while the memories of her family were so fresh, so painful, but she also needed this. She needed the distraction, so she made herself continue. He'd whisper it to me at night when I couldn't sleep, and it would chase away the sounds of the other prisoners and the barking of the dogs and the noises of the guards, for you want to hear it. Tilda remained silent, and since Kiva was beginning to tremble at what was coming the next day, she decided that she might as well tell the story, if only for her own sake. Once upon a time, it had helped bring her peace. Perhaps it would now too. Closing her eyes, Kiva continued to hold Tilda's hand as she recited. My father was raised down south, in Valerian, while my mother was born in Lamont, way up in the north, close to the border of Miravan. They were so far from each other that there was no reason why they should ever have met. Papa used to say it was fate that brought them together, or destiny, or, when he was feeling poetic, the alignment of the stars. Kiva smiled, even as she used her free hand to wipe a tear from her eye. But it was chance more than anything, since they both happened to be in Valenia for the celebration of King Stellan and Queen Ariana's nuptials. Papa was an apprentice healer at the time, and he couldn't resist sneaking away to visit the most renowned apothecary in the capital. Unbeknownst to him, the store was a hot spot for thieves and pickpockets. Before Papa knew what was happening, his purse had been cut, and suddenly he was chasing the perpetrator down the streets of Valenia, only to corner her in an alleyway and demand the return of his gold. Kiva continued smiling as the story played out in her mind. That was when the thief turned around and lowered her hood, and Papa saw her for the first time. Her smile widened. He said that it was love at first sight. At least on his part. I never got to ask Mama what she thought. A lump rose in Kiva's throat, and she held Tilda's hand tighter, as if doing so could ease the pain inside her. In a husky voice, Kiva went on. Papa was so love-struck that he stood there gaping like a fool, and Mama was smart enough to take advantage. She'd been living in Valenia for a couple of years at that point, having run away from her family in Lamont after... Kiva halted when she realized she was getting off track and started again. She'd been in the capital for long enough to know those streets well, so it was easy for her to get past my dullard father and disappear in the crowd. Papa was devastated, not for his coin purse, but for the greater treasure he was certain he'd just let slip through his fingers. Kiva was smiling once again as she continued. He searched for her and asked everyone he could think of, but none of his reputable acquaintances knew how to find a thief. So, in an act of desperation, Papa headed to the docks in the dead of night, aware that it was a hive for criminal activity, especially after dark. She shook her head. As an affluent young man who was clearly visiting from out of town and wandering around in a bad neighborhood, he was asking for trouble. Sure enough, he was attacked and left for dead, but luckily for him, my mother had been watching from a distance. After stealing his gold, waiting for him to replenish his coin, since he'd already proved to be such an easy mark, instead of stealing more from him, she had ended up saving his life. Sobering, Kiva said. I wish I could say they lived happily ever after. They did for a time, very happily. Her voice turned croaky again, but things happen in life that you don't expect, that you can't plan for, and you're helpless to stop. Their story didn't end as it should have, but I know for a fact they'd live it all over again, even the ending, as long as it meant they could keep their beginning. But Papa, the endings are the best part. Sometimes, sweetheart, but other times the beginnings are. Kiva released Tilda's hand so she could use both of hers to wipe her cheeks. She didn't know why she was hearing her father's voice so much lately, why the memories were coming to her so often. It was both painful and soothing, like part of him was still with her, a reminder that she wasn't alone. So Kiva said in an overbright tone, standing to her feet, "That's how my mother and father met." Looking down at the ill woman, she went on, "I hope that wherever your mind is right now, you can hear me. I hope that you dream about that story and the love they shared. And I hope it reminds you that there are so many reasons for you to fight, whatever ails you, but the biggest one is that there are people out here who love you and need you to wake up. People who love you in return. So if you can't do it for yourself, do it for them." Kiva leaned in closer and whispered in her ear, "Fight, Tilda. You're stronger than this, and they're coming for you." Then she straightened and walked back over to her workbench to clean up the mess she and Mott had made, ready to dose the rats with the elixir and begin mentally preparing for the next day. Her father's story had done what she'd needed, brought peace to her soul, and her words to Tilda were just as much to herself. Even if the rebels didn't arrive in time to free them for the ordeal, Kiva was going to fight, to keep fighting, because there were people in here who needed her. There were people beyond Zalandov's walls who she was determined to see again. Her family was waiting for her. They were coming for her. She knew it, like she knew her own name. One day they would be with her together. They would be together again. She refused to allow her story to end before that day came. Alright, so we're up to chapter 19 and page 198. So we're 49.1% of the way through. Alright, let's get back here. We've got 17 billion cookies. So, let's see what we're going to do. Alright. Look at all those cookies. Alright, 40 of those. 20 of those. 3 of those. And we got 2 cookies. Oh, excuse me, please. We got 2 achievements. So, Cookie Pulsar and Transmogrification. Stats. I was like, I can't remember what to do. Bake 10 million cookies per second. And the other one's probably just, having 50 Alchemy Labs. Yeah. Let's do some more clicking, because I'm assuming all these ones are going to be for clicks too. Sorry, I have hiccups now. So if I do some more clicks, then it'll be like, bake this many cookies from clicking. So, I don't know. Well, we have 3 viewers. I don't know who the 3 viewers are. But, if you're watching, let me know. Say hello in the chat. But yeah, if you're watching, let me know your thoughts. Do you have any thoughts? Do you have any theories? Novak has been messaging me. Hi there, Sharky. Novak has been messaging me. Sorry, I just had to do a big yawn then. Yeah, has been messaging me with his thoughts. And I think he's wrong about all of them. Ooh, double thick glasses. Grandma's twice as fish. Why not? Alright, 90 of those. 100, 100, 90. And then 50 of all those. 40, 20, and 3. So, let's continue on with the next 2 chapters. Chapter 19. After sharing her father's tale with Tilda, Kiva ventured out to the medicinal garden, a place where she always felt close to him. Alicia and Nurgle had arrived early for their shift, so she knew there was someone watching over the sick woman, ready to call out at the first sign of trouble. But Kiva felt confident that Tilda was stable again, at least for the moment. Sorry, I just have to keep yawning. I'm just so tired tonight, so we probably won't go for like too much longer. But yeah, anyway. Walking along the gravel path, Kiva ran her fingers through the gabba grass that rose taller than she did, obscuring much of the trail ahead. The long green shoots were technically weeds, but the stems could be milked and used to soothe earaches, and Kiva liked the privacy they afforded, the illusion that this was a little slice of paradise tucked away in the middle of the prison, just for her. "This can be our place, little mouse," her father had told her. "Whenever we need to get away from it all, we can come here, our very own sanctuary." Kiva closed her eyes as his voice washed over her, her fingers still weaving through the grass. She only opened them again when she came to a bend in the path, following it around in a loop. To her right were the flower beds, marigold, calendula, lavender, and poppy flowers, alongside the snow blossoms and buttercress. Opposite them were the berries, then the sprouts, then the herbs, then the nettles. On and on it went. The garden organized into sections by the types of plants, and also by their medicinal qualities, with the most dangerous specimens at the furthest end of the looping path, their own separate bed to lessen the risk of accidental spreading. Glancing around, Kiva recalled the first time she'd set foot in the garden, her father having led her by the hand along the path at sunset. "It's our secret," he'd told her with a wink. "As long as I'm the prison healer, you can sneak back here any time you want." "But what about the guards, Papa? We'll make it a game," Farron had replied. "Hide and seek. Just like you used to play with Zuli and Tor." And he'd broken off then, before mentioning Karen's name. Never mentioning Karen's name. Kiva swallowed as the memory came to her. Her father, the prison healer. It was only logical that he'd been allocated the position upon arriving at Zalindol. He'd been sent straight to the infirmary on his first day, working under the head medic, a bitter woman named Thessa. Farron was much more qualified, but Thessa had been in charge for years and refused to listen to him, let alone learn from him, or yield to him. Kiva hadn't thought about Thessa in a long time. She knelt down to pluck some thistles choking the bed of goldenrod. She cast her mind back to those early days filled with fear and sadness, but also holding moments of joy, like when her father had brought her into this garden for the first time. Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll never lose hope, he whispered to her in this very spot kneeling before the golden root. Your brother and your sister and your mother, his voice had cracked then, they will come for you one day. Don't you mean us, Papa? They'll come for us? Farron had reached out and brushed his fingers along her cheekbone. Of course, sweetheart, that's what I meant. Only a few short weeks after that, Vesta had died from a stomach sickness, and Farron had stepped into her position as the head medic, leaving Kiva alone much of the time, especially when his hours were soon taken up by... Kiva's body froze, her fingers spasming in the soil. Vesta had died from a stomach sickness. Her father had become the head medic, and then... Kiva strained her memory, trying to recall everything she could about the first year. She'd only been 7, too young to fully understand, too young to remember. And yet, there was something she would never forget, even if she had forgotten. Until now, the stomach sickness, it had happened before. 9 years ago, dozens dead, hundreds, including, eventually, Kiva's father. Tears sprang to Kiva's eyes, her fingers still frozen in the earth, her gaze unfocused as the memories played out. Farron had given everything to his patients. Kiva had barely seen him in those last few weeks as prisoner fell to the illness. Her father had told her not to worry, that she was young and healthy and had nothing to fear, but she'd seen the pallor of his skin, the bags under his eyes, the concern bunching his forehead, even as he'd tried to reassure her, day after day. He'd promised she was safe, and she'd trusted him. He'd never promised that he was safe, and she'd never thought to ask. Then one day he didn't return to their cell block. Even when he'd stayed back late with the quarantine patients, he'd always returned to their cell block. Every night, no matter how exhausted he was, he always found the energy to teach Kiva everything he knew about healing, reminding her how important it was to learn, to understand. Night after night, he would share his years of knowledge, testing her with imaginary patients and their ailments. Only when they were too tired to continue, he would tuck her into bed and tell her a story, usually the same one about how he met her mother, knowing how much she loved her. She loved it, and it helped soothe her. They were some of the worst memories Kiva had. They were also some of the best, but that night he didn't return. Kiva knew. He would never again teach her his craft, never again tell her a story. Wiping her hand across her eyes, Kiva racked her brain for anything he might have told her back then, anything that could offer a hint as to whether the sickness now plaguing the prison was the same as the one from 9 years ago. Had her father tried to find the source, like she was? Had he figured out what had caused it, or how to treat it? Or had he merely sought to keep his patients as comfortable as possible until they met their ends? Until he met his end? Kiva couldn't remember how long the sickness had lasted. She had been so lost in her grief that after his death, that time had ceased to mean anything. But she remembered her 8th birthday, because it was the first time she'd stepped back inside the infirmary after her father had died, after he'd left her. There was a new prison healer in charge, Kiva's predecessor, whom she started working under 2 years later, and whose position she adopted another 2 years after that. No one had been sick by the time her birthday arrived. Kiva remembered, the stomach illness having passed. She knew because she'd had to hunt down the healer in an empty quarantine room, where she'd found him mixing an illicit batch of angel dust in the far corner. He jumped upon her arrival, demanding to know why she was there. She'd told him one of the prisoners in the workroom had been beaten by a guard and was close to death. The healer hadn't cared. He'd pulled a vial of poppy milk from his tunic and said to give it to the victim, then told Kiva to leave him alone. On her way out of the infirmary, she'd visited the garden. With tears pouring down her face as she said her final, silent goodbye, she'd made her decision, plucking up some aloeweed, and pilfering some balico sap and spare linens from the infirmary on her way out. She'd treated the beaten prisoner herself, just as her father would have done. From that moment on, Kiva had resolved to continue his legacy, knowing he was gone, but that he was still with her, and he always would be. More tears leaked from Kiva's eyes now, and she rose to her feet, breathing in the fresh, earthy scents of the garden, her father's sanctuary, her sanctuary, their sanctuary. Farron Meriden had died of a stomach sickness, perhaps the very same one that Zalandov's prisoners were again suffering from. It had been 9 years, but Kiva would not let his death be in vain. He'd given everything, including his life, to try and save the sick back then. Kiva was determined to finish what he'd started. She was determined to find a cure this time, to stop the illness in its tracks. She didn't know if it had been done before, or if last time it had just faded out, or organically. But she wasn't willing to wait out weeks, perhaps months that could take. She didn't have that long anyway. After her trial tomorrow, she would only have another 4 weeks left to carry out her tests, and if she survived all of the remaining ordeals, and if her family and the rebels didn't help her escape before then, that didn't leave her much time to come up with a cure, but Kiva would still do what she could for as long as she could. Nodding to herself, Kiva brushed her hands on her pants, dislodging the soil, and made her way back along the path. The garden had offered her peace, just as it always did, but it had also lit a fire in her, a desperation that she felt honor bound to act on. She would make her father proud. She would succeed where he had failed. That night, Kiva left the infirmary, her eyes bleary from spending the late afternoon hours writing down everything she could think of about the illness. Her hands ached, her fingers still twitching from how vigorously she'd worked them. But she was satisfied that if she were to suddenly leave Zalandov or die, then someone would be able to take up her research. She wished her father had thought to document his findings, or even Fessa before him, but there was nothing. Kiva had checked every inch of the infirmary, and the only parchment she'd found was her predecessor's secret recipe for a more potent version of angel dust. Fury had simmered within her at the discovery. Since his job had been to help prisoners, not turn them into addicts, she hoped he was rotting in the everworld, reaping what he'd sowed. Muttering under her breath about the abysmal nature of humankind, Kiva entered the refectory, a large building filled with long wooden tables, most of which were currently populated by hungry, tired prisoners being served by other hungry, tired prisoners. Lately, Tip had been bringing her rations directly to the infirmary, but tonight she wanted to be among the other inmates, partly to remember what it was like to be around living, breathing people, but also to get a read on the prison atmosphere and a sense of whether they were at risk of another riot breaking out. Usually it was Cresta and her rebels who incited the violence, but not always. Sometimes it was something small that built into something large. Other times there was no reason at all. Without a proven formula, Kiva was apprehensive about the coming days, especially with the trials throwing in a new unknown element that would cause further unrest, or ease it. Most of Zalandov's inmates had no stake in whether Tilda lived or died. Only a small percentage of prisoners were rebels, and they alone would care whether Kiva survived the ordeals. If only for the sake of their queen. But for the rest of the populace, were they excited for tomorrow's trial, or were they frustrated by the interruption to their routines? Were they jealous they didn't have their own chance at freedom? Were they resentful towards Kiva for volunteering in Tilda's place? Did they want her to succeed, or did they want her to fail? Did they even care? And if they did, or didn't care, was that enough to stir them into a frenzy that could turn deadly? Because that was what had happened in the riots. People died. Kiva didn't have any of the answers, but she hoped that by being around some of her fellow prisoners, she might be afforded some insight. She'd barely walked halfway along one of the tables before the hushed conversations made her realize things were worse than she'd feared, but not because of the trials. More and more friends getting sick. Heard the rebel queen is shacking up with the warden. Dozens dying every day. Quarantine expletive, forget what's coming to her. Hasn't come out of quarantine. Snuffed that so-called queen in her sleep. A tickle in my throat. Do you think it could be, the healer's doing nothing? The last made Kiva's feet slow. She couldn't help but listen closer. While alarmed by the anger she sensed toward Tilda, she was also unsurprised. If what the warden and Jaren had said were true, the rebels had caused a lot of damage in their quest to reclaim Avalon, and hurt a number of people along the way. It was almost a boon that the rebel queen was so ill, since she was safe within the bounds of the infirmary, protected from the wrath of her enemies inside the prison. With her being watched around the clock, any anti-rebels eager to hasten her demise would only be courting their own deaths. For now, Kiva was more concerned by the whispers about the sickness and the newest conversation she was overhearing specifically about her. "Why would she do something?" replied another man, with only the back of his bald head visible. "She's too busy having fun with the guards, ain't she? Having too much fun to be bothered keeping the rest of us alive, am I right?" A guffaw came from his companion, as flames spread across Kiva's cheeks. Neither of them were aware of her presence, and she hurried onward before they realized, but not before hearing the original speaker say, "I'd be up for a bit of fun with her, you know what I'm saying? What cell block is she in again? Or maybe I'll just pay a visit to the infirmary, tell her I'm sick and need some good quality nursing." Kiva's stomach lurched as both men laughed, and she stopped moving forward instead, spinning on her heel, having heard enough. It was just as she'd feared. The prisoners were angry, afraid, uncertain. Word about sickness was spreading, and there was plenty of unrest because of Tilda and what those two disgusting men had said. They doubled the guards at the outer perimeter. Rumor has it the rebels tried to come for their queen. All thoughts of the two men fled Kiva's mind, and she came to a dread halt, whirling around to find a trio of prisoners whispering together, 2 women and a man. It was one of the women who had spoken her words, all but stopping Kiva's heart. "What did you just say?" she breathed, forcing her way into their conversation. The second woman and the man both sneered at Kiva, but the first woman only eyed her warily before sharing. Some of the lumbersmiths said there was a disturbance where the forest meets the perimeter fence. Said it was a group of rebels trying to break in. She tilted her head to the side and added, "You'd better watch your back, healer. If they get in and you're in their way, they'll slit your throat to get to their queen." Kiva's mouth was so dry that she struggled to speak. Did they make it through the fence?" The second woman scoffed and said, "Of course not. No one makes it." Kiva's vision began to blacken, fearing the worst, until the man jumped in and said, "The guards are furious that they didn't catch any of them. That's why they've doubled the watch, in case they try again. They won't, though. The rebels aren't fools." Kiva couldn't listen any more. On shaking legs, she retraced her steps and hastened out of the refectory, her appetite gone. The rebels had come. The rebels had come, and they had failed. Had her family been among those who had risked their lives? If the guards had caught them before the man had spoken, Kiva had feared they'd been captured or killed. Her relief in knowing they'd fled to safety was overwhelming, and yet, that's why they've doubled their watch, in case they try again. They won't, though. The rebels aren't fools. The man was right. The rebels weren't fools. But what did that mean for Kiva? We are coming. They had come. Would they do so again? Did they have another plan to get Tilda, to free both her and Kiva? For the first time ever, Kiva contemplated seeking out Cresta in the hope of gleaning more information. But the risk wasn't worth it. The prison rebels were unpredictable, especially their leader. If Cresta decided to take her anger out on Kiva, it was Tip who would suffer. Tip who would die if Cresta lost control. No, for now, Kiva had to wait. Anxiety churned within her as she walked along the path between the refectory and the cell blocks. More than ever, she longed for an easier way to communicate with the outside world. Surely the rebels had other plans. Surely they would try again. Perhaps even now they were searching for a different entry point, a weakness in the perimeter, a means to slip in and out again. The Queen was imprisoned. They would come for Tilda, no matter what. And Kiva's family would come for her, no matter what. Feeling slightly more confident, Kiva was nearing the first of the cell blocks when someone called out to her. You, healer! Sucking in a sharp breath, Kiva halted on the path. She turned slowly, already recognizing the voice, dreading what it could mean. Bones was striding toward her, his long legs eating up at the distance. His crossbow draped casually over his shoulder, his black eyes like death. "We need you at the barracks," he said, a clear order. Kiva swallowed and nodded, then trailed quickly after him when he beckoned her to follow. Bones was like a wild animal. Sometimes he was temperate, sometimes he was not. Every week she treated prisoners who had suffered his wrath. Broken fingers, wrists, ribs, anything that made a hearty snap sound was his preference. Kiva had long since trained herself not to feel sick in his presence, though there were times when she still had to force down bile. She feared that whatever he was leading her into tonight, it might be one of those. Kiva couldn't stop thinking about Nari's warnings of late, how she'd been deliberate in staying back in the infirmary with Kiva or making sure Kiva knew not to leave on her own. It was winter. The guards were agitated. It happened every year, and every year Kiva managed to survive the worst of it, just as she would survive tonight. "In," barked Bones once they reached the entrance to the barracks. Kiva stepped through the wooden doorway into the stone building, even as everything within her wanted to run, screaming in the other direction. She couldn't risk Bones seeing her reluctance, or what he might do to her because of it. If he caught so much as a whiff of rebellion from her, he would revel in making her pay. His black eyes told her as much, the anticipation gleaming in them as he watched her like a hawk eyeing its prey. "This way," he said, moving past her, close enough that their bodies brushed. Kiva stopped breathing, dread rising within her, before she forced her heartbeat to settle. Nothing had been done to her yet. There was no reason to believe anything would be done to her. The guards needed her alive, not just as their entertainment in the ordeals, but as their prison healer, especially with this sickness spreading. She was their best hope, and they knew it. They would not risk breaking her, physically or mentally. Bolstered, Kiva followed Bones down a hallway, past closed doors that she knew led into private quarters, and toward a large communal room at the end of a long corridor. Someone was playing music, which Kiva rarely heard a sound of, and while she couldn't pinpoint the source, she recognized the song as an old lament her mother used to sing when she was a child. Nostalgia washed over her with the force of a wave, but as her eyes scanned the room, the comfort of the memory was swept away in an instant. The guards were having a party, or the Zalandov equivalent of one. Open bottles of spirits lined the wooden tables, food piled up beside them, mostly untouched, despite the drink being almost gone. Guards were at ease around the room, all of them men. Curled up in their laps were prisoners in various states of undress, all with glossy, fevered eyes and rosy cheeks. Kiva had an inkling of why she had been brought here. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or not, her initial fear being that she was to become a plaything, but now that one had a bit too much fun, Bones said, pointing to the far corner where the butcher sat leaning back in an armchair, a half-naked prisoner draped across his legs. Kiva didn't know the prisoner, but she could see the woman was unconscious, just as she could see that the butcher didn't care, or perhaps didn't realize, his own eyes out of focus, his head lolling to the side, a watery smile on his lips, as he nuzzled the woman's hair in his hands. This time, Kiva did have to swallow back bile. Mustering her courage, she walked over to the two of them, aware that Bones was shadowing her. The other guards barely glanced their way, too distracted by their own prisoners to care what was happening in the corner. Upon reaching the butcher, Kiva took stock of the situation. She thought it was just spirits in the room, that the guard and prisoners alike were inebriated. But up close she saw the golden powder glittering on the woman's fingers, under her nose, on her lips. She saw the same on the butcher, his eyes half lidded, his hands still roaming, unaware that the prisoner he held wasn't responding. Because she couldn't. Kiva didn't need to check her pulse. It was obvious. The woman was dead. Overdosed. On angel dust. Rage rose within Kiva, strong and true. These guards didn't care. They just wanted their playthings, their entertainment, and then they would discard them again. The prisoners meant nothing to them, even their favoured ones, live or die. It was all the same to people like Bones and the butcher. Well, healer, Bones prompted. Can you wake her up? We're not done with her yet. It's time for round 2. You mean 3, called another guard. 4, came a different voice. Bones chuckled, and this time Kiva feared she wouldn't be able to swallow back all she was feeling. Fisting her hands tightly enough for her nails to pierce skin, she used the pain to ground herself. Only when she was certain she could open her mouth without risk did she answer, I can't wake her. She's dead. The song of lament was still playing, and the chorus echoing in the wake of Kiva's declaration. My love, I'll wait for you until we meet at last in the Everworld. What do you mean, dead? Bones demanded. Kiva's voice was flat as she replied, dead as in lifeline. Dead as in lifeless. I know what dead means, you little... What's going on in here? Kiva could have fainted with relief at the sound of Nari's voice, and she turned to find her standing at the entrance to the room. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the place. What's it look like? Slurred an unknown guard in the back, stroking the arm of a giggling woman wrapped around him. We're having a party. You should join us, Arel. Let your hair down. He hiccuped a laugh and pointed to Nari's cropped locks. Oh wait, you don't have enough. There was nothing even remotely funny about what the slurring guard had said, or what he was doing. Healer, you're needed in the infirmary, Nari said, her eyes flashing with anger, though Kiva knew it wasn't directed at her. Now wait a minute, Bones said, reaching out and grabbing Kiva's forearm. His grip was so tight that she winced, aware that it would take only a little more pressure from him to snap her wrist. A bead of sweat trickled down her neck, and she froze to the spot, barely breathing. We've just lost one of our girls, Bones told Nari, jerking his chin to the overdose victim. We need someone to replace her. Kiva's insides plummeted to her knees. The healer is needed in the infirmary, Nari repeated, her voice firm. She didn't move from the entrance, but the air in the room changed, a charged feeling emanating from where she stood. A warning, a threat, and a promise. The healer can go to the infirmary, Bones said. He tightened his grip enough that Kiva felt her bones grind together and had to hold back a whimper. But she can go after. Then you can explain to the warden why he has to wait. It was as if Nari had performed magic, her words prompting Bones to release Kiva fast enough that she stumbled. Why didn't you say Rook was waiting for her? He said, disgruntled to Kiva. To Kiva, he said, get out of here. She took one relieved step forward, but he reached for her again, grabbing her wrist and squeezing her already bruised flesh as he leaned in and whispered, Tell the warden about this and his little pet or not. Next time we throw a party, you'll be right back here. But it won't be as a healer. You'll be here for round 4 and round 5 and round 6, he squealed harder. He squeezed harder. Understood? Ugh, yuck. Kiva nodded, all of her energy focused on not letting tears of pain and fear flood her eyes. That's a good little healer, Bones crooned, finally releasing her and giving her a nudge between her shoulders, propelling her forward. Enjoy the rest of your night. Kiva walked on shaking legs towards Nari, who reached for her, but stopped when Kiva visibly recoiled. Nari's hand fell in the air, her eyes filled with enough concern that Kiva couldn't look at her, lest she lose control of everything she was trying desperately to keep from pouring out. She's too busy having fun with the guards, ain't she? Having too much fun to be bothered keeping the rest of us alive, am I right? Zalandov's expletive, the Princess of Death, the healer expletive. Kiva had chosen this life. She'd chosen to be obedient to the warden, to let the guards order her around and treat her as they saw fit, as long as it meant she would remain alive. But that didn't mean she wasn't affected by what she'd just faced, that she wasn't traumatized by seeing the overdosed woman, by knowing that it just as easily could have been her. Nari didn't try to speak to Kiva as she led her back to the infirmary. As she led her not back to the infirmary, but straight to her cell block and then inside. Only then, when they stopped at her pallet, did Kiva croak out, "But the warden." "I lied," Nari said. "Rook isn't waiting for you." Kiva nearly broke down then and there, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded and whispered, "Thank you." "We're not all like that," Nari whispered back, her voice pained. "I know," Kiva said hoarsely. And she did, because Nari was evidence that some guards were good. But what had just happened, what Kiva had just witnessed, what she'd nearly experienced, Kiva couldn't get it out of her head, not even after Nari left, and the cell block began to fill with people bunking down for the night. Hours passed as she lay on her pallet, curled into a tight ball, trembling. Sounds faded as prisoners fell into exhausted sleep on either side of her, and Kiva knew she should join them, the time for her second ordeal swiftly approaching. She needed her strength for what she might face the next day, especially given what she'd learned about the rebels' failed rescue attempt. Unless they had another plan already in the works, then Kiva would be completing the trial by fire. She needed to rest, but every time she closed her eyes she saw the overdosed woman, the butcher's roaming hands, the angel dust glittering on them both. She heard Bones' threat on repeat, along with the words from the men in the refectory. "She's too busy having fun with the guards, ain't she?" The healer expletive. "That's what everyone thought she was. They were wrong. The heartless carver. She wasn't that either. Though right now she wished she was. If only it would take away everything she was feeling." Kiva wasn't sure how long she lay there, shaking beneath her thin blanket and holding her bruised wrist protectively to her chest, before she heard quiet footsteps, before she felt the tender hand on her shoulder, followed by the pallet depressing as someone lowered themselves onto it at her back. She didn't jump. She knew who it was. The scent of fresh earth and sea spray was something else unique to Jaren. Like morning dew mixed with wood smoke preceded him, wafting soothingly against her nostrils, bringing a comfort she couldn't begin to fathom. "Nari told me what happened," he whispered, knowing she was awake, thanks to the tremble still racking her frame. "Are you all right?" Kiva shook her head. It was too dark for him to see, only a thin sliver of moonlight creeping in from the small square windows dotted sporadically along the walls, but he could feel the movement. His hand moved from her shoulder, trailing down her arm until he carefully wrapped his fingers around her sore wrist. Kiva didn't ask how he knew which one it was. It was all she could do not to start sobbing when he cradled it gently, so very gently in his hands. "I'm sorry, Kiva," he whispered. A tear slipped out of her eye, then another. "I'm fine," she made herself say. Her voice was rough, painful to her own ears. "I'm really fine." His thumb stroked featherlight against her skin. "It's all right not to be." Kiva swallowed, then swallowed again, but the lump in her throat wouldn't dissolve, and the tears in her eyes wouldn't stop falling. She didn't resist when Jaren lay down on the pallet and turned her to face him, pulling her into his arms. She knew she should send him away, but she couldn't summon the will, instead burrowing deeper into his chest as he held her close, his tunic muffling her sobs and soaking up her tears. It was only when she'd cried her last that sleep finally found her, and she drifted off, wrapped in Jaren's embrace, feeling safe and protected for the first time in years. Chapter 20. How are you feeling? Kiva looked up the next morning to see Jaren walking across the infirmary toward her. In this light, she could see that his face was still a palette of colours, but the swelling around his eye had almost disappeared. What are you doing here? She all but squeaked. Shouldn't you be in the tunnels? Panicked, she pointed to the doorway he'd just stepped through, noting with no small amount of relief that it was unguarded. You need to leave before someone catches you. Jaren had the audacity to chuckle. Relax, Kiva. Relax? Relax? That was perhaps a poor choice of word, given everything, he said, stepping close enough to place his hands on her shoulders. How about this one instead? Breathe. Kiva tried to do as he said, inhaling as deeply as she could, her shoulders rising and falling with his hands, never leaving them. She didn't shake him off, finding his touch more comforting than she should have liked, especially after last night. They hadn't spoken of it, even after they'd woken up, tangled in each other. Kiva had felt a momentary burst of alarm, coupled with extreme mortification, but Jaren had simply rubbed sleep from his eyes and slurred "good morning" before asking more articulately how she was. A garbled, unintelligible response had left him laughing softly, which had annoyed her enough to glare at him. If you can look at me like that, he said, grinning, then I know you're going to be all right. Then he'd brushed his fingers down her cheek and left for the bathing chambers. That was it. No awkwardness, no embarrassment, no bringing up what had happened the previous night, before or after he'd joined her in bed. It was clear he was letting her come to terms with it, all of it, without pushing, and for that she was grateful. She'd spent the morning compartmentalizing the previous day, from Tilda's near death to her revelation in the garden about her father and her stomach sickness, to what she'd overheard in the refectory, and finally with her run-in with the guards. Mulling over it all, Kiva had been left knowing one thing. She'd survived 10 years at Zalandov. 10 years. Yesterday had been rough, but she'd survived through worse, even from the guards. At least this time there was no physical damage, aside from the bruise blossoming on her wrist. Kiva was alive, and that was what mattered most, and it was also what made her realize that there was no point in dwelling on what had happened. It was over, and all she wanted was to let it go and move on. She'd had a moment of weakness with Jaren last night, or perhaps strength, depending on perspective. He'd given her what she'd needed when she'd needed it, and she was thankful, so thankful. Even now he was here with her again, offering comfort once more, not because of what she'd been through yesterday, but because of what she was facing today. The second trial. Yet another reason Kiva needed to rid her mind of the previous day in focus. Following Jaren's instructions again, she made herself breathe deeply the second time. Better? He asked. You still need to go, Kiva said, instead of answering. I wanted to see you before your ordeal, Jaren said. Are you ready? Of course I am. Jaren's eyes remained locked on hers, waiting for the truth, and Kiva sighed. Fine. I'm a nervous wreck. Happy? A gentle squeeze of Jaren's hands on her shoulders as his gaze softened. You've got this, Kiva. No one survives all the trials, Jaren, Kiva whispered, her stomach in knots, as it had been ever since she'd slathered her skin with Mott's caronut oil concoction that morning. Now that the time was nearly upon her, she lacked confidence in its protection, more aware than ever that if the rebels failed to mount a second rescue attempt, then the princess's amulet was her best chance for survival. Perhaps her only chance for survival. Her life was in the hands of a Valentus, a cruel twist of fate indeed. You've already made it through one, Jaren said, low and soothing. You can do it again. But I believe in you, he interrupted, without any hint of doubt in his voice. Tip believes in you. Mott believes in you. He paused. Even Nari believes in you. Most prison guards wouldn't care whether I live or die. Nari doesn't seem like most prison guards, Jaren said, stating the obvious. She's clearly fond of you. That's because I'm the only person standing between her and death if the sickness continues, Kiva muttered, though she knew that wasn't the only reason. The guard did seem to genuinely care for her, even lying to the other guards last night to protect her. Jaren tucked a strand of hair behind Kiva's ear, causing her to suck in a breath. But before she could do anything, jerk away, lean forward, remain frozen, he stepped back, both of his hands now resting casually by his sides. Maybe, he said, his lips twitched, or it could be because of your warmth and kindness and overall sociability. Kiva crossed her arms. Ha ha. Jaren laughed quietly, the sound loosening some of the knots in Kiva's stomach. Tipping his chin toward the rat pen, he asked, "Any progress?" Kiva latched onto his offered distraction with unhidden gratitude. Quickly explaining about Mort's elixir, she finished with, "I think we can rule out the quarry as the origin. If something was going to happen, it should have shown by now." "So, back to the drawing board?" Jaren asked. "More like continuing on to the next sketch," Kiva said. "Maybe you'll do after... Which you'll do after you pass today's ordeal," Jaren said, his voice full of confidence. Kiva swallowed, holding his gaze steady. "Right. It's nearly time," came Nari's voice as she strode into the infirmary. All breath left Kiva, first because she wasn't ready, and second because Jaren wasn't supposed to be there during work hours. For one mad second, she wondered how she could hide him before sanity took hold of her and she realized it was too late since Nari was already staring straight at him. "The other prisoners are being assembled," the guard told him. "You need to hurry and join in with the rest of the tunnelers before anyone realizes you're not with them." Jaren gave her a quick nod before turning back to the dumbstruck Kiva. "See you afterwards. No biddings of good luck or fortune, and certainly no farewell, only an encouragement that they would see each other again, something that wouldn't happen if she faced a trial. Because she'd be dead." Kiva was confused. Jaren hadn't held back in berating her after she'd volunteered to take on Tilda's sentence, but today he seemed to have complete conviction in her ability to succeed. His turnaround surprised her, almost as much as Nari, being unconcerned about finding him somewhere he shouldn't be, and that Kiva couldn't begin to understand. Just as Jaren reached the doorway to the infirmary, nearly disappeared through it, Kiva called out his name, prompting him to pause and look back over his shoulder at her. "I've sent Tip to help Mott in the morgue today, since I want him to stay busy and not have time to think about anything," Kiva said. Will you... She broke off, swallowed, and tried again. "Just look after him, please." Jaren's face softened. "I'll keep an eye on him during the trial, but after that you'll keep looking after him yourself, just like you promised." He then vanished into the grounds, his words lingering in the air between them and inciting hope within her, while simultaneously adding to her dread. If the rebels didn't come, if she didn't make it through the ordeal... "Any idea of what to expect today?" Nari asked, interrupting Kiva's near-to-spiraling thoughts. "A few," Kiva replied, "but I've been mostly trying not to think about it." "Probably for the best," the guard said. Kiva had avoided walking anywhere near the gallows over the last few days, wanting to keep from discovering whether construction had begun on a wooden pile. While she still prayed for a rescue, if one didn't come in time, then she could only hope that her trial by fire would require something much less confronting than being burned alive. However, she couldn't shake her feelings that the ordeal would be dramatic. Even though the royals weren't attending this time, the rest of Zalandor's population would be standing as witness. So the warden and the other overseers must still be intending to make a spectacle of it. "Is there anything you need to do before we leave?" Nori asked. "We have a few minutes." Kiva took a moment to consider. There was none of Mott's waxy mixture left, so she couldn't slather any more onto her skin. She'd already looked in on the quarantine patients, and sent 2 more bodies to the morgue. She'd also checked Tilda's vitals, confident the woman's health was stable enough that she wouldn't slip into a convulsion while the ordeal was underway. Nothing I can think of, Kiva finally answered Nari. She didn't want to leave until they had to, so she stalled by saying, "But I do have a few questions for you." Nari looked at her, waiting. Kiva remembered a time when she wouldn't have dared ask the guard anything, and here she was, deliberately prolonging a conversation, if only to delay her own impending doom. For all she knew, her family and the rebels just needed a little more time. If they really had already tried to infiltrate Zalandov, surely they would do so again. Perhaps they were outside the walls this very moment, waiting to strike, ready to flee, with both Kiva and Tilda in tow. Even as she thought it, Kiva's spirits dimmed. "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll never lose hope," her father had said to her in the garden. "Your brother and your sister, your mother, they will come for you one day." Maybe they would, maybe they had, and maybe that was it. Over, done. It was suicide breaking into Zalandov. If they'd already doubled the guards, Kiva knew the truth, even if she wanted to deny it, to ignore it. The rebels weren't coming. Her family weren't coming. They had tried and they had failed. Perhaps they would try again when things calmed down, when the guards' vigilance faded, but that would take time. And Kiva didn't have time. She had an ordeal today. Hope was a drug and Kiva was an addict. She couldn't help believing, couldn't keep trusting, couldn't keep hoping. We will come. 10 years her family had waited, 10 years. We are coming. They should have already come before now, before Tilda, but they hadn't. Hurt rose in Kiva's chest, blinding in its intensity, but she pushed it away, shoving it deep within her, just as she had for years. It was up to her now, up to Kiva to survive. First the trial by fire, and then whatever came next. Regardless of what her father had tried to make her promise, she couldn't keep waiting for help to come. Instead, Kiva would save herself, just as she had for the last 10 years. She was a survivor, and she would survive this. "Kiva?" Jolting Nari's prompt, Kiva realized she'd remained silent for too long, and she scrambled to cement her new resolve while considering one of the many questions that lingered in her mind, settling on the newest addition. "Why didn't you punish Jaren for not being in the tunnels today?" Nari cocked her head. "That's twice this week you've asked why I haven't punished another prisoner." Kiva scratched her nose, uncertain how to respond. Here's the thing," Nari said, unfolding her arms and stepping closer. As far as I'm concerned, you're already punished enough just by being imprisoned here. You don't need trigger-happy guards making things worse for the sake of a power trip. Should Jaren have snuck out of the tunnels? No, of course not. Did he take a stupid risk by coming here to see you? Absolutely. But I figure if the tunnel guards didn't catch him, then that's on them, not me. For all I know, he could have been allowed to come here because he's sick or injured. So if anyone asks, that's the story we're going with. Agreed? Kiva's mouth hitched up at the corners. Got it? She paused, and thank you. For what? Holding her gaze, Kiva remembered what the guard had said last night and answered, for not being like the rest of them. Nari's amber eyes softened. She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could utter anything, Bones arrived at the doorway to the infirmary. Kiva's heart leapt into her throat at the sight of him, but she reminded herself of her decision to let go of what had happened and move on. She was going to see Bones around the prison. It was unavoidable. If he thought she was afraid of him, he would only make her suffer. She would not be cowed. "They're ready for you," he said in a gruff voice, wincing slightly as he took in the brightly lit room with the sun streaming in from the windows. Kiva might have felt some delight at his evident hangover if his words hadn't been ringing in her ears, even though she'd only moments ago resolved to save herself, to survive. That didn't mean her fear wasn't nearly crippling now that the time was upon her. Irrationally, Kiva suddenly recalled a million things she needed to do. She should check on the quarantine patients again. She should give Tilda some more broth to keep her hydrated. She should see if the rats were showing any symptoms. She should... Calm down, Nari whispered, stepping closer. You can do this. Kiva desperately wanted to clutch the amulet to center herself, but she knew doing so would risk drawing attention to it. So she settled for feeling the heavy weight of it hidden beneath her tunic against her breastbone, a solid reminder that she would not be facing the trial alone. Nari was right. She could do this. Follow me, healer, Bones ordered Kiva. He then turned on his heel and strode off towards the guards. Strode off across the grounds. Kiva's pulse hammered in her ears as she walked on leaden feet after him. She found some small comfort in Nari's presence, the woman remaining at her side, offering quiet solidarity. That comfort dissolved, however, when Bones turned north rather than east, and she began to see prisoners milling much closer than they had 2 weeks ago, packed tightly together in a space that wasn't intended for large gatherings. Unlike the eastern quad where the gallows stood, when Bones made another turn, Kiva realized why. They weren't heading toward the gallows. They were heading to the crematorium. Ba, ba, ba. Well, I think that's probably a good spot to leave it to, because I am just constantly yawning. So that will be a good cliffhanger for everybody listening. To keep you on your toes for next week. We're at 55.6% of the way finished. So I think, yeah, that will be a good spot to leave it. Keep you on your toes as they head towards the crematorium for the second trial by ordeal. So I'll just quickly do some wrap-up things for here. 31 billion. Wow. So let's get some of these up here. Oh, a prism. I just realized that we had unlocked that. Nice. Converts light itself into cookies. Nice. Let's get 100 of those. $68, $69. We'll get 70 of those. 100 of those, 100 of those. Ooh, look. Yay, we got a frenzy. We got a cookie and a frenzy. So we'll just click. Because I think the frenzy is 7 times the amount, is it, Sharky? I prefer the frenzy one to the other one. I mean, obviously I get more cookies because I get 7 times well, the amount or whatever. The material strain banner box for achieving purple. Yeah, that's fine. I think it's 7 times. Ooh, achievement unlocked Clickorama. Yay! Okay, let's look at the stats. See that Clickorama one. Make 1 billion cookies from clicking. So I assume these 3. I apologize because up there before I counted those. That's not actually right. The clicking ones are down here. So I assume these 3 are also clicking ones. also got gingerbread scarecrows. Nice. 10 billion cookies. That's a lot of cookies. 80, 90. Bill Christinas. Oh, 94. I did wonder. I didn't think I would be able to get 100, so I'll get up to 100 and then I will stop the stream. And you will all have to wait for next week. Novak is going to be messaging me tomorrow when he wakes up and catches up on the stream, and is not happy when I leave it on the cliffhanger. But I actually just finished while we're clicking, and I'll talk. I actually just finished the entire series. I just finished the last one, and I literally screamed at the ending. It was a very good wrap up to the story, like, and just the way that the characters, interacted with each other. Like, it wasn't forced or wasn't rushed. People had their natural character development, and the way some characters interacted with each other based on things that happened in the second book. It just wasn't rushed. Like, that's the biggest thing. Like, it wasn't like, oh yeah, everything, nothing happened, and let's just pretend nothing happened. Like, they really had the development of what had happened. And the way, therefore, characters interacted with each other. Which is great. Man. 7 to 8 minutes away from 100 factories. Well, that's fine. I'll probably maybe just get one more, and then I will leave. I will leave the stream going. Not the stream. Once I've finished, I will leave Cookie Clicker going until I get up to 100, and that way next week when I start, I'll just get that off stream. Next week when I start, I'll start with 100, and we will go from there. So thank you everybody for watching. I hope you all enjoyed yourself. I hope you enjoyed the story, and we will be back next week to find out what happens with Skievers' trial by ordeal, the fire one. Bye bye.